Tarantia gives water to mountain lion trapped in a tree trunk, but what it does after... Silas had no plans for that day. No big plans, at least. It was just another morning like any other, waking with the sun, drinking the coffee his mother had left on low heat since early, pulling on his boots still damp with dew, and going to check the fence that had broken in the lower meadow. That was it. But it was on the way to the fence that he heard it. At first, it was a sound he couldn't name. Something between a growl and a groan coming from inside the old oak trunk that had fallen in a storm years ago. Silas stopped. In country life, you learn to respect what you can't identify right away. He stood still, watching, and then he saw the eyes, 2 points of yellow light deep inside the hollow trunk, blinking slowly in that darkness, and along with them, heavy breathing, irregular, the kind of breathing that says something is struggling. Silas didn't run off, but he didn't move forward either. He stood there in the heat that was already burning his shoulders in that early morning, trying to understand what was in front of him. That's when the mountain lion showed its snout. It opened its mouth slowly, baring white teeth, and let out a low, hoarse growl that seemed to rise from deep in the earth. But its eyes said something else. It wasn't the look of something about to attack. It was the look of something cornered and afraid, something that no longer had the strength to hide the fact that it needed help. Silas understood in that moment the animal was trapped. The hollow trunk had a narrower point in the middle, and the mountain lion's hind legs had gotten wedged in there, stuck in the old bark that was rotten on the outside, but hard as stone on the inside. The animal's belly was rising and falling too fast. It had been stuck for a while, judging by the look of it, all night. Silas took a few steps to the side, slowly without taking his eyes off her. The mountain lion followed every movement with its head, its damp snout drawn tight, its eyes half closed with exhaustion. He knew that trunk by heart. It had been there for over 10 years, in the middle of the dry pasture he called the lower meadow. But he had never seen anything like this. He walked back to the yard, unhurried, like someone who doesn't want to spook anything. Mr. Otis was fixing the handle of a hoe when he saw the boss walk into the shed with that look on his face. Otis was 52, his hair graying at the temples, and he'd worked on Silas's ranch since before the two of them got old together without noticing. "What is it?" he asked. "There's a mountain lion trapped in the old trunk down below." Otis set down the hoe without asking any more questions. He followed Silas back to the pasture, the two of them walking fast without running, and when he spotted the animal from a distance, he stood like stone in the middle of the dry pasture. "My God! It's stuck! Look at how she's breathing. And what are you going to do?" Silas didn't answer right away. He walked to the edge of the creek that cut through the pasture on the east side and came back with the little water bottle he always carried in the pocket of his jeans. It was still almost full. He looked at it for a moment, then started walking toward the trunk. "Silas!" Otis called out, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who's scared but doesn't want to show it. "Stay where you are." He approached slowly, very slowly, his crumpled hat on his head, his orange shirt soaked with sweat on his back, his knees bending carefully against the hot ground. The dry grass poked through even his pants. The mountain lion growled again, that enormous mouth opening, but its body didn't move. It was exhausted, dehydrated, most likely had been for hours in that blistering sun. Silas knelt about 6 feet from the trunk. He opened the little bottle and tilted it slowly, letting a thin trickle of water spill toward the animal's snout. Just a trickle at first, so she could catch the scent. The mountain lion stayed motionless for a second that seemed to last much longer. Then the tongue appeared. She licked the damp ground, licked her own paws, and when Silas tilted the bottle a little more, she opened her mouth and let the water in with a quiet eagerness that made the man's heart tighten in his chest. The growling stopped. Her body relaxed, just a little, but enough for Silas to let out the breath he had been holding without realizing it. Behind him, Otis watched it all with his hand covering his mouth. "Look, I read this passage about 3 times before I could continue. Because there's something in that scene that goes beyond the obvious. A man afraid, and a mountain lion afraid, both on the same hot ground trying to trust each other for a second. You don't see that every day. Silas stayed there for over an hour. He went back to the creek, filled the little bottle, came back. The mountain lion drank little by little, and between one rest and another he tried to look at the trapped paws to understand if he could help free them, but the bark of the trunk was firm where it needed to be. He would need a tool. That's when Otis arrived with an axe and a crowbar without anyone having asked. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting everything on the ground, with the care of someone standing near something that could change its mood at any moment. With great care and plenty of time, the two of them broke apart the part of the trunk that held the animal. The mountain lion stayed almost quiet during the process, as if she understood what was happening. Or maybe she was too exhausted to resist. At some point between noon and 1 in the afternoon, the last splinter of wood gave way with a dry crack. The mountain lion pulled her paws out slowly. She stayed inside the trunk for a long moment, motionless. Then she came out, like someone who just woke up from a bad dream and needs to first understand where she is. She looked at Silas. He didn't move. She looked at Otis. Otis was barely breathing. And then the mountain lion turned and walked off across the dry pasture toward the scrubland, without running, without looking back. She disappeared among the low trees and tall grass, as if she had never been there. The two of them remained silent for a good while, standing in the pasture, the sun beating down from the side. "What a story, Silas," said Otis finally, his voice hoarse, like someone who'd held his breath for too long. "What a story," agreed Silas, and the problem was exactly that. What a story. Because Otis, who had the habit of telling everything to his wife when he got home, told. And Otis's wife told the neighbor on the lower street, and the neighbor told her son who worked at the general store. And from the store the story ended up on the community message board, and from there it spread all over the area like water on dry ground. In less than 2 days, everyone knew that Silas Miller had knelt down on his own knees on the pasture ground to give water to a mountain lion, and then freed the animal with his own hands. Most thought it was beautiful. They were amazed, sent messages congratulating him, wanted to know the details. But Hank Sterling didn't find it funny at all. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Hank was a rancher on the property that bordered Silas's on the north side. A man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and short on patience, who always held the view that any wild animal near livestock was a problem to be solved before it turned into disaster. He showed up at Silas's gate 2 days after the incident, his pickup truck kicking up red dust on the dirt road. "You turned the mountain lion loose," he said, even before getting out of the truck. "Good morning, Hank. You turned the mountain lion loose, and now the animal is prowling around the properties. My neighbor on the left lost a calf. A calf could have died from any number of things. Or it could have been the mountain lion you let loose in the middle of our lands like it was a pet." Silas stood looking at him without answering right away. There was a patience built from decades of life in the countryside, where you learn that most arguments settled by force only create bigger problems. But there was also a point where that patience ran out. Benedito, that animal was trapped and thirsty inside a hollow log. If I had walked past and done nothing, how could I live with that? I wished you had thought about your neighbors before playing the hero. I wasn't playing the hero. I did what was right. Hank gripped the steering wheel with both hands and stared ahead for a second, like a man swallowing what he really wanted to say. If that animal attacks anything of mine, I'm going to have to take action. If you have proof it was her, we'll talk. Without proof, there's nothing to talk about. Hank drove off without settling anything, but he left behind that feeling of something starting to simmer without showing on the surface yet. Silas stood at the gate watching the dust from the pickup truck vanish down the road and felt a weight on his back that wasn't just the heat. That same afternoon, when the sun was already low and he was on the porch with a glass of water, he heard a car pulling up in front of the house. It wasn't a pickup like Hank's. It was a small car, the kind you see in town covered in red dust from all those miles of rough road. And from the car door stepped Abby. Silas stood there with the glass in his hand. His daughter, 22 months without setting foot on the ranch, without letting anyone know she was coming, without calling ahead to say a thing. Abby was 36 years old, with the same dark eyes as her father, the same way of walking like someone who knows exactly where she's going. She had been living in a big city since she was 22, had built a life there, and the last time the two of them had been in the same room for more than 10 minutes, they had both walked away angry about things neither of them could quite name. There was a distance between them that had grown without either one ever making the move to reach for the other. "Dad," she said, stopping at the porch steps. "Abby, I saw the story on the community message board. I figured it would stay in the area. It went far." She paused. "Can I come in?" That was when the voice came from the kitchen, clear and steady as it had always been. "Abby! My God, girl, let me get a good look at you." Mrs. Martha was 78 years old and had a presence that filled whatever room she walked into. Her white hair cut short, her glasses always sliding down her nose, and a clarity of mind that put plenty of 50-year-olds to shame. She hugged her granddaughter tight, held her by the shoulders, studied her face as if taking inventory of how much time had passed. "You lost weight. You always say that, because you always do. You're staying for dinner. That's already decided." It was the kind of reunion that the surface smooths over, but underneath carries a load of things left unsaid. During dinner, Silas watched his daughter without being able to fully understand why she had come. Yes, the mountain lion story had gotten around, but Abby wasn't the type to show up at the ranch for just anything. There was something else underneath, and there was. But the answer took 2 days to come out. In those 2 days, the time they spent together was tense in a way that only someone who has lived through a long-awaited reunion can describe. It wasn't open fighting. It was the opposite. An excessive carefulness with words, conversations that touched on everything except what mattered. Abby helped in the kitchen with her grandmother in the morning, went out for a walk around the ranch with her father in the afternoon, but there was always a thin pane of glass between them, that distance you can't name but can feel in your skin. Otis noticed all of it but stayed quiet, which was what he knew how to do when the situation called for it. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that the mountain lion showed up again. Not near the house, not down in Hank's pasture. She was on the bank of the creek that divided Silas's land from the scrubland, lying in the shade of a clump of cottonwoods, staring off into nothing with that stillness only large animals can manage. Silas saw her first from a distance and stood there without making a sound. Then Abby came up beside him, not noticing that he had stopped, and nearly tripped over her father. She followed his gaze and saw the animal. For a long while the two of them stood there shoulder to shoulder without speaking. "Is it her?" Abby whispered. "I think so." "How do you know?" "There's a mark on her right shoulder. Looks like an old scar." The mountain lion rested her head on her paws and closed her eyes. She was resting. There on the edge of Silas's land, as if that place had stayed tucked away in her memory. Abby kept watching for a long time. Then she said, in a low voice, "Dad, you need to tell me about the ranch, about the, Silas didn't answer right away. "What ranch?" "Yours. The debt. Julian told me." Silas turned his face toward her. For the first time since she had arrived, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was closer to the weariness of someone who has carried something heavy for too long. "Who's Julian?" "He's the man I've been living with for 3 years, Dad. You know he exists." "I know he exists. I didn't know he was keeping an eye on my debts." "He's not keeping an eye on anything. He found out by chance because he knows the loan officer who handles the rural line of credit for this region, and he told me because he was worried about me." Silas turned his eyes back to the mountain lion, who stayed quiet at the water's edge without knowing she was the center of anything. "How much do you know?" he asked, his voice lower. "I know you've been in debt for 4 years. I know you've renewed twice, and I know that if you don't resolve it by the end of the year, you could lose the property." She said all of it without an accusing tone, slowly, like someone setting stones on a glass table. But the effect was that of a stone thrown all the same. Silas stayed silent. There are things we carry alone thinking we're protecting the ones we love, and only later do we realize the silence was what weighed the most. I know what it's like to be the father who doesn't want to worry his daughter, But silence has a price that takes us a long time to understand. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because it wasn't your concern. I'm your daughter. And you left. You chose to leave. And that was fine. I'm not blaming you. But when you left, I understood I was going to run this ranch alone. I took that on as my decision. Running it isn't the same as hiding that you're sinking. The mountain lion, there at the creek's edge, stood up slowly. She stretched like an enormous cat, looked at the two of them for a second that seemed to last longer, and disappeared into the scrubland without making a sound. Neither of them noticed she had gone. That night, it was Mrs. Martha who sat with the two of them on the porch and laid things out on the table with the frankness of someone who has lived too long to waste time on beating around the bush. "I knew," she said, taking off her glasses and wiping them with the corner of her apron, as she always did when she was about to say something important. "I've known for 2 years. Silas told me. And I asked him not to tell you, Abby." Abby turned her face toward her grandmother slowly. "You asked him?" "I did. Because you had just gotten established in the city. You had that new job, that man. I didn't want you coming running back here feeling obligated to save something. It wouldn't have been fair to you. And letting my father drown was fair. Your father didn't drown. Hayes here, standing on his own 2 feet, taking care of this land like he has for 30 years. What happened is that things got heavier than anyone expected, and we thought we'd sort it out before we needed to call you." Abby kept looking at the two of them, her father with his big hands spread open on his knees, her grandmother with her glasses in her hand, both of them with that quiet dignity of people shaped by life without asking for any discounts. "This Julian," said Silas suddenly. "He's coming here?" Abby hesitated a second longer than she should have. "He's coming tomorrow." "What for?" He has a proposal for the ranch." The silence that fell then was different from every other one that night. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now let's continue. Julian arrived the next morning in a bigger and newer car than Abby's. He was a 40-year-old man, well-dressed, with the easy manner of someone used to walking into places he doesn't know and leaving with what he came for. He greeted Silas with a firm handshake, smiled at Mrs. Martha with that charm of someone who wants to be well received. Mrs. Martha served the coffee without returning the smile with the same warmth. She sat at the table, quiet, watching. Julian's proposal was straightforward. He had partners interested in acquiring a rural property in the region to turn into an area for industrial farming. Silas's ranch had the right size, the right location, the right soil. The amount offered would pay off the entire debt and still leave a considerable reserve. Silas could stay in the main house for another 2 years while he got his affairs in order. It was a well-put-together proposal, the kind that seems generous when someone is backed into a corner. Silas listened to it all without interrupting. Then he stayed silent for a length of time that grew uncomfortable for Julian, who had expected a quicker answer. "Did you talk to Abby about this before you came?" Silas asked. "I did. She knows what it's about." "And you, Abby?" She was on the other side of the table. Her eyes were on her coffee cup, her hands still on the table. And it was right then, at that moment, that Silas saw his daughter in a way he hadn't been able to see her since she'd arrived. Not as the girl who had left, as a woman who was in the middle of a hard choice and was trying to make the right one. "I didn't bring him here to sell your ranch," she said finally, carefully but firmly. "I brought him so you'd have a way out if you wanted one. But it's not what I want to happen." Julian turned his face toward her with an expression that mixed surprise and discomfort. "Abby, we already talked about this." "You talked. I listened. That's not the same thing." It was the first time Silas had seen his daughter disagree with her partner in public, without softening it, without backing down. And he felt, at that moment, that there was between the two of them a longer story than the one about the ranch that had yet to be told. Mrs. Martha got up from the table slowly, gathered the cups and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "This land was bought by Silas's grandfather. He and 4 brothers worked for many years to save up the money. Then Silas's father expanded it, and then Silas. It's not just a piece of property. It's what's left of each of them, carved into the ground. She stopped at the kitchen doorway. But land without someone to care for it just becomes land too. She went into the kitchen, and the words hung there over the table like smoke. Silas stared at the old wood of the table for a long moment. Then he said, without looking at anyone in particular, "You know what I learned this week from a mountain lion?" Julian didn't know what to say to that. He stayed quiet. When you're trapped, accepting help from wherever it comes isn't weakness. It's survival. But, he raised his eyes, letting that mountain lion go wasn't survival. It was a choice, not to walk past something that needed you without doing anything, just because it was easier to pretend you hadn't seen it. He looked at his daughter. "I did wrong by you. I didn't tell you about the debts because I thought I was protecting you. But really, I was taking away your right to choose, and you're my daughter. You have that right." Abby didn't say anything for a moment, but her eyes grew moist and she didn't look away. It was Julian who broke the silence, in a voice that had lost much of the confidence it had at the start. "So, what do you want to do?" "I'll think about it," said Silas. "I need time. The financial situation doesn't give us much time. I know that, but a decision made in a hurry is rarely a good one. I learned that early on." He got up from the table. "I'm going to go check on the cattle." And he left. Abby stayed with Julian in that room for a while. What the two of them talked about in there, only they know. But when she went out to find her father in the pasture, she had a different expression on her face. Less torn, like someone who had finally made a decision that was a long time coming. She found him at the old fence, the same fence he had gone to check on the day it all started. Silas was there, in his hat and worn-out jeans, fixing the wires with hands that had been doing that since they were a boy's hands. "Let me help," she said. Silas looked at her. Then he made room without saying a word. They stayed there for almost 2 hours, fixing the fence, talking little at first, then talking more. About what had broken between them, without either of them being able to say exactly when. About the choices each of them had made, and the ones they had avoided. About what each had expected from the other, without ever having the courage to say it out loud. Abby said she had money saved up. Not enough to pay for everything, but enough for a down payment that could open the door to renegotiating under fairer terms, and that she wanted to help figure out a way for the land to support itself better. Silas stood still, holding the wire. "Are you sure about this?" "Not completely, but I know I don't want to get 10 years down the road and find out I stayed quiet when I shouldn't have." He looked at her for a while. Then he said, his voice a little thick, "You look a lot like your grandmother, you know." She laughed. A real laugh. The first since she'd arrived. And Silas laughed too, for the first time in days, that short, dry laugh of someone who isn't used to laughing at himself, but couldn't hold it back. In the days that followed, Julian left with the offer unanswered. The goodbye between him and Abby was quiet, as goodbyes tend to be between two people who are at different points in their lives and are only just beginning to realize it. Abby stayed. She and Silas went together to the county seat, sat down with a loan officer, and spent the whole afternoon looking at numbers that weren't pretty. But they were possible, with Abby's down payment, with a well-negotiated refinancing, and with an adjustment in what the ranch produced. There was a way forward. Narrow, but it was there. Mrs. Martha waited for them with dinner on the table and a question in her eyes. Silas came in, hung his hat on the hook on the wall like he'd done every day for 30 years, and said, before even sitting down, "It's going to take some work, Mum, but it's going to work out." The old woman closed her eyes for a second. Then she smiled in a way that seemed like she'd been waiting for those words longer than anyone had imagined. As for Hank, the mountain lion never came near his cattle. The calf that had gone missing showed up 3 days later, in a hole behind the corral itself, alive, without a scratch. Nobody could explain it, but nobody felt the need to, either. Hank didn't go to Silas's ranch to apologize, but when the two crossed paths on the dirt road a week later, Hank honked his horn. And in the scrubland where that kind of man lives, a honk is worth more than a lot of words. The mountain lion was seen 2 more times over the following month. Always near the creek, always from a distance, always quiet. It never caused anyone any trouble. It seemed to have found a piece of the scrubland where it felt, somehow, at home. Otis used to say, "A wild animal has a long memory for anyone who was good to it." Silas never said whether he believed that or not, but the first time he caught sight of it again on the other side of the meadow, he stood there by the fence line and watched for a long time. Hat in hand, the hot wind blowing across the dry field, the marks of decades on his face, like someone who recognizes an old acquaintance and doesn't need words to say it. The end. Sometimes you need a moment you weren't expecting to understand what you'd been needing for longer than you knew. Silas didn't go to that meadow looking for any answers. He went to check a broken fence, and he found a thirsty mountain lion, a daughter with doubts, and a ranch with a path still worth traveling. All of it there, waiting for him to stop long enough to see. Tell us in the comments what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Would you have done what Silas did? Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and don't miss the next stories we've saved with so much care for you.